You know, sometimes there's fights that get booked from the UFC, and the second you see it, you just know it's going to deliver, and that is exactly what the main event of UFC 317 is, not to mention all the storylines, the legacy, and what is at stake in the bout. But let's just look at the numbers real quick. 62 combined fights between Ilia Topuria and Charles Oliveira. Do you know how many of those have gone the distance? Well, if you guessed 8, then you are correct. 54 out of 62 combined fights between these two fighters have ended inside the distance, have not needed the judges' scorecards to determine a winner. Ladies and gentlemen, fasten in, buckle your seatbelts, and when you're watching the main event this weekend, please do not leave your seat. When you really look into this fight and analyze what all had to happen, all of the different scenarios across featherweight and lightweight for these two, Ilia Topuria, the Matador, Charles Oliveira, Du Bronx, to be standing across the octagon from one another with a lightweight vacated title on the line to happen, it's quite mind-blowing. Because in order for Charles Du Bronx Oliveira to challenge for his lightweight title shot back in May of 2021, not only did he have to rally off 8 consecutive wins in a row, all by the way 7 of them by way of stoppage, but he also had to rely on Khabib Nurmagomedov vacating his title in October of 2020. And that was after 3 successive title defenses, with that last one being against Justin Gaethje in Abu Dhabi, sail off into the sunset with a perfect 29-0 record. And then Du Bronx would get his opportunity, and he would welcome in Michael Chandler, who debuted in January of 2021 with a big splash when he knocked out Dan Hooker. So there we would have it, the surging Charles Oliveira versus the former Bellator champion turned UFC newcomer Michael Chandler for the vacated lightweight title. And we would see Charles Du Bronx nearly be finished in the opening round of that fight. Dare I say, you could have even argued it would have been a 10-8 round for Michael Chandler, but Charles Oliveira would survive. He would advance to the stool, he would get himself up for round 2, and he would stop Michael Chandler via TKO in what would take just 19 seconds. He would go on to successfully defend that championship one time when he would beat Dustin Poirier at the end of 2021, submitting him 1 minute and 2 seconds into the third round of their fight. And then in May of 2022, he was set to defend his throne for a second time against the ultra-dangerous highlight reel that is Justin Gaethje, but there was the whole weight miss drama surrounding Charles Oliveira that would halt him from technically entering that fight as the champion. He would be stripped, therefore Justin Gaethje could win the lightweight title that night, but if Charles won, it wasn't a title defense, it wasn't even for him to win the belt back. And so what would Charles do? After being knocked down, as we were used to seeing happen to him with the consecutive fights prior, he would bounce back and in just 3 minutes and 22 seconds submit Justin Gaethje with a rear naked choke. So although it wasn't his second consecutive title defense, it was another victory at the marquee of the lightweight division. Therefore, he would go on to in October of 2022 face Islam Makhachev in what I guess you could say could have been his third attempt at defending the championship, but instead it was a vacant title opportunity, the second time Charles had competed in one of those. But that is when we would see the rise of Islam Makhachev come to fruition, and he would fulfill the prophecy of his protege Khabib and become the lightweight champion of the world. After dominating Charles Oliveira, he would get the finish 3 minutes and 16 seconds into round number 2, and the rest is history with Islam Makhachev. He would go on to break the record for title defenses in the 155-pound weight class by beating Alexander Volkanovski twice, by beating Dustin Poirier, and by beating Renato Moicano on just 1 day's notice in January at UFC 311. But here we are now at UFC 317, International Fight Week 2025, and Islam Makhachev has vacated the lightweight title. He will be chasing the welterweight championship of the world in a fight that is likely to happen in the fall of this year against the newly crowned Jack Della Maddalena. And before we get into Ilia Topuria and how he got to this point, let's at least touch on what Charles has done since that loss to Islam. After that, he would go on to, in June of 2023, defeat Benny Dariush Benil, who is also on this UFC 317 card against Renato Moicano, and Charles would finish him in the first round via TKO in one of the more dominant performances that Charles had in those past few years, because he didn't have to go through as much adversity as he has had to go through with some of the others. And then after a 10-month hiatus, Charles would come back to UFC 300 in a number one contender fight against Arman Tsarukyan, and they would go back and forth for 15 minutes, where you can argue that Oliveira should have came out the victor, but instead it was Arman Tsarukyan via split decision. And to finish out 2024 at UFC 309 in Madison Square Garden, we would see Charles Oliveira take on Michael Chandler in a rematch nearly 4 years later, and he would get the decision win over the course of 25 minutes in their co-main event. And I said how impressive the performance was that Charles put on against Beneil Dariush for the 4 minutes they were in the cage together. Well, he put on one of the best performances, maybe the best of his entire career against Michael Chandler in their rematch. Yes, Michael came on strong in the 5th round and had a great finish, but prior to that, it was all Charles Oliveira in that one. So he has went 2-1 since losing that championship fight to Islam Makhachev back in October of 2022, and that loss was to Arman Tsarukyan, who was slated to face Islam at the beginning of this year at the aforementioned UFC 311 card, but during fight week, on the day before the fight card, during weigh-ins, Arman Tsarukyan would have to pull himself out of the bout due to his back tightening up, hindering him from going out and performing. That is why Renato Moicano, who was scheduled to face Beneil Dariush on that night in the Intuit Dome in LA, will get the opportunity on 1 day's notice to take on Islam Makhachev for the lightweight championship, and of course we know that Makhachev will go on to dominate that fight. And Dana White said in the aftermath of UFC 311, because of what had happened with Arman, he was not going to get the next crack at the lightweight title, but it is worth mentioning he'll at least be the backup fighter for this fight between Charles and Ilia. And for Ilia Topuria, the former featherweight king, he would start his UFC career 6-0, with 5 of those wins coming by way of stoppage, and in that lone decision against Josh Emmett in June of 2023, he would beat him up so bad there was a 50-42 scorecard. And that was enough for him to earn the number one contendership spot against Alexander Volkanovski at UFC 298 in February of 2024, where he would become the first man in the featherweight division to ever knock out and even beat Alexander Volkanovski. He would knock him out in the 2nd round of their fight. And so after Ilia Topuria made history by becoming the first man in the featherweight division to beat Alexander Volkanovski, he would then go on to defend that title against the former champion Max Holloway, and not only would he win that fight and successfully defend his throne and remain undefeated, but he would become the first man to ever knock out Max Blessed Holloway, the greatest chin that the sport has arguably ever seen. And one of the narratives about those back-to-back wins with the title on the line and with the greatness and legacies that Holloway and Volkanovski carried into each of those bouts, many said that it was the best back-to-back winning stretch that they had ever seen in the UFC's history, and if it wasn't the best, it's definitely up there. But after that one defense, we would see Ilia decide to move away from 145 pounds as he was done trying to suck himself dry to make the weight. He wanted to challenge Islam Makhachev for the lightweight title. However, we learned that Islam was only going to stay at lightweight if Belal Muhammad defended successfully against Jack Della Maddalena at UFC 315 in May, but he did not, meaning that Islam got the green light to move up to 170, vacating his lightweight title, meaning Ilia vacated his featherweight title to get this opportunity this weekend. So then in April at UFC 314, we would see Alexander Volkanovski, the former champ, regain his throne with a victory over Diego Lopez. Are you kidding me? That is all of the things that had to happen for this fight to come to fruition. All of those wins, all of the vacant title opportunities. For crying out loud, this is going to be the 3rd vacant lightweight title fight that Charles Oliveira has been a part of. Islam vacating the lightweight title because Belal Muhammad at 170 pounds didn't successfully defend. Ilia vacating his featherweight title because of Belal Muhammad not winning at 170 pounds. It truly is a 3-weight class saga that got Ilia Topuria and Charles Oliveira in the main event of UFC 317. And don't get me wrong, Ilia Topuria versus Islam Makhachev, 2 of the 3 best pound-for-pound fighters on planet Earth today, squaring off against one another, would have been one of the biggest fights the UFC could put on in 2025. And now that we're looking at it, with John Jones retiring over the weekend, it would have been the biggest fight of 2025. But This is a close second. Charles Oliveira, the former champion, the all-time leader in finishes, the all-time leader in submissions, the all-time leader in post-fight bonuses in UFC history, versus the matador, Ilia Topuria, who at just 28 years old is 16-0, a perfect record with 14 of those victories by way of stoppage, dethroning the great Volkanovski, knocking out the great Max Holloway, and now looking to become a two-weight world champion against Bronx Oliveira, coming up a weight class. As a mixed martial arts diehard fan, this has every single thing you can think of from a storyline perspective, not to mention the X's and O's of this fight. Charles Oliveira, all of those submission credentials that we previously alluded to. But fight by fight, we've seen the progression and evolution in his striking skill set. He has true knockout power. I believe it was even Justin Gaethje that said Charles Oliveira was the hardest hitter that he had ever faced. And Ilia Topuria enters this fight off of back-to-back knockouts over Max Holloway and Alexander Volkanovski, but the man has more submission wins on his resume than knockouts. And that includes a submission win over someone who, heading into their fight, was known as a submission ace in Bryce Mitchell. So can he do that again? Can he submit another Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt in Charles Oliveira? I said today on X, on one of the UFC's posts, I replied and stated, someone find me the betting prop for Ilia Topuria by submission, or, because those are bets that you can place, especially on DraftKings at least, Charles Oliveira by knockout. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go look right now. Yep, those odds are plus 300. Am I going to be a degenerate and sprinkle? You'll just have to find out when I post the bet slip later this week. And how will that power of Ilia Topuria carry over up a weight class to 155 pounds? I think that is a very important question to ponder in the lead up to this fight, because if I'm being quite frank, I don't think that Ilia Topuria was the biggest featherweight in the world, so it's crazy to fathom that he's moving up to 155, even crazier to fathom he's considering going to 170 and chasing Islam Makhachev. But that's a discussion for later on in the year. Ilia Topuria moving up to lightweight. Can he have that knockout power, follow him up a weight class, and be able to knock out Bronx, who, yes, has been suspect to getting knocked out in the past, but as of recent, we've seen him be able to get back up when getting put down on his ass, fighting back and finding his way to a finish victory, and even multiple times now by way of knockout in his own right. I'm fascinated to see how this fight plays out. Will Charles Oliveira sprint himself out of the gate and charge at the matador like a bull? Will Ilia Topuria be able to remain calm like we've seen him do with his methodical approach to all of his fights? Will he implement any kicks? Will Charles Oliveira throw some Muay Thai teep kicks up the middle to throw off Ilia Topuria? We haven't seen him really have to go through much of that. Will the underrated wrestling of Ilia Topuria come into play here, even though we know how dangerous Charles Oliveira is on the ground and specifically off of his back? Is Ilia going to even want to test that side of things? There's literally questions for days about this fight. I think it is one of the biggest fights in the lightweight division's history. I think it's probably the most guaranteed banger main event in all of 2025 so far. And there's gold on the line. There's legacy on the line. The future of the lightweight division. The future of maybe the featherweight division. Dare I say the future of the welterweight division. So much rides on the shoulders of Ilia Topuria with a perfect record, and Charles Oliveira, the former lightweight king, looking to reclaim his throne. I want to hear all of your thoughts on this fight, and give me your predictions for the UFC 317 main event down in the comments below. And now that we are done with the championship main event, let's get into the championship co-main event. Alexandre Pantoja looks to continue solidifying himself as the second best flyweight of all time, only behind Mighty Mouse Demetrius Johnson. Can he defend his title for the fourth time? And in order to do so, he will have to take out his former foe from 9 years ago, Kai Kara-France. That's right, I said rematch, because Alexandre Pantoja and Kai Kara-France first met in July of 2016 on The Ultimate Fighter in the quarterfinals of Season 24, and that happened after Alexandre Pantoja would defeat Brandon Moreno on the opening day. And we would see Pantoja get the victory via decision over Kai Kara-France, albeit just a 2-round fight because it's an exhibition. And now here we are nearly 9 years later to the month, and they will be squaring off once again, but this time not for the Ultimate Fighter quarterfinals, but for the flyweight championship of the world. I felt pretty confident that in the aftermath of UFC 310 in December of last year that Alexandre Pantoja had solidified himself as the second best flyweight of all time, undeniable at that point in my opinion. I mean, this guy has quite literally ran through the entirety of the division. So much so that I'm going to tell you, he's beaten Brandon Moreno 3 times if you want to count their fight on the Ultimate Fighter, with that third fight being for the championship at UFC 290 where Pantoja would become and new. Well, Moreno currently sits at number 2 in the division. Pantoja has beaten Matt Schnell, who was a perennial top 15 flyweight before his retirement. He has beaten Manel Kape, the former Rizin champion turned UFC top 10 flyweight, currently sitting at number 6 in the world, and he was supposed to be taking on Brandon Royval on this same night for a number 1 contender fight before being pulled due to injury. Oh, Brandon Royval fighting on this card? Yeah, Pantoja's beat him twice. Once via submission during his win streak to get to Brandon Moreno, and the second time in a title defense, the first of his reign at UFC 296 in December of 2023, Brandon is currently number 1 in the division. He's beaten Alex Perez, who currently sits at number 7 at 125 pounds and is a former title challenger. He's beaten Steve Erceg, who currently sits at number 9 and is the most recent win for his opponent this weekend, Kai Kara-France. And in his third title defense at that event at UFC 310, where he solidified himself as the second greatest flyweight of all time, he took out another former Rizin champion in Kai Asakura, who currently sits at number 15 technically in the rankings, but he was launched into that title fight against Alexandre in his debut fight in the UFC. He's not only ran through everyone in the division, but he's literally lapping people. The multiple wins over Brandon Royval, the multiple wins over Brandon Moreno, and potentially, if he wins this weekend, multiple wins over Kai Kara-France. He is absolutely the most underrated and most overlooked champion in the UFC right now. He is on a 7-fight win streak and looking to defend his title successfully for the 4th time. That's something we really don't see in this modern era of mixed martial arts, especially post reigns of Kamaru Usman and Israel Adesanya and Alexander Volkanovski. He is someone who genuinely doesn't want to chase the money. He wants to just continue building upon his legacy and cementing himself as an all-time great at 125 pounds. And that is exactly what he's doing, fight by fight, name after name, dare I say, victim after victim. And I just feel like he is a jack of all trades. He is truly skilled in all facets of mixed martial arts. Yes, he's not some world-class striker, but he can compete with anyone on the feet. And when it goes to the grappling, with his clinch control, with his ground control, with his Brazilian jiu-jitsu expertise, he is a threat everywhere that this fight could potentially go, and that doesn't change with this opponent in Kai Kara-France. Kai actually enters this fight having lost 2 of his last 3 bouts. However, his most recent fight was against the aforementioned Steve Erceg last August at UFC 305, where he would not only win, but he would decapitate Steve Erceg in the first round via knockout. And let's be honest, if you go to the fight before that against Amir Albazi in June of 2023, it was, dare I say, a robbery. I don't want to throw around the R word too often, but that one was pretty close. Kai Kara-France should have got his hand raised that night. And before that, he was challenging for the championship against Brandon Moreno because he had tallied off 3 consecutive wins in order to get to that opportunity at UFC 277, but Moreno would halt him and finish him, as a matter of fact, in the 3rd round via TKO that started with a vicious body kick. So sure, Kai does have 4 losses in the UFC, and his record isn't the prettiest because of those losses, but look at this. It's 2 losses to Brandon Moreno, it's a loss to Brandon Royval, and it's that very controversial loss to Amir Albazi, who is still a very highly accredited flyweight right now. And Kai carries something with him that a lot of flyweights do not carry, and it is true one-shot KO power. But can he utilize that against someone as durable and as tough as Alexandre Pantoja? That is yet to be seen. KKF is 32 years old, so right in that prime, and he looks to bring a 3rd championship to the Australia/New Zealand area of the world, with Jack Della Maddalena being a newly crowned champion and Alexander Volkanovski regaining his throne for a 2nd time. And whilst I said that Pantoja can compete with anyone on the feet, I'm not saying he should go in there and look to have a straight up kickboxing or boxing match with Kai Kara-France because of that devastating power that he possesses. However, if Pantoja looks to implement his grappling and clinch work, Kai Kara-France cannot be slept on with his takedown percentage of 88%. But I will say that the longer that this fight goes, if it stretches into rounds 3, 4, and 5, that is where Pantoja will really begin to find success in my opinion. So if he falters early on with his takedown attempts, I look for the success rate to pick up as the fight carries along. Especially because we've seen him go 25 minutes numerous times. We've seen him go the distance plenty of times, whereas Kai Kara-France has not had that full 25-minute experience outside of the lone fight that he went the full 25 with Amir Albazi. And it's funny because we've seen moments in these Pantoja fights, really in all of them that have gone 25 minutes over the course of his title reign, where he has looked absolutely exhausted and gassed, but somehow, some way, he pulls some shit out of the fire, flips a switch, changes gears, and just steamrolls through and reclaims that title by any means necessary. And you can bet your bottom dollar he's going to look to do the exact same thing here against Kai Kara-France. And one last thing that's worth mentioning, because I'm sure it'll come up in the community this week, is the 35 years of age and older at 170 pounds or lighter statistic, because Alexandre Pantoja has now entered the 35-year and up category. But if there's anyone outside of course, Alexander Volkanovski, who just punched that narrative right in the face, that can also prove that narrative false, it is Alexandre Pantoja, otherwise known as the Cannibal, who, again, I can't state enough, is one of the most underappreciated champions maybe that we've ever had in the UFC's history, and especially right now amongst the current crop of champions in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. But what do you think? Will Kai Kara-France's one-shot power be enough to dethrone the dominant at this point Pantoja, or has Pantoja just simply faced too much high-level competition, and has he had too many high-profile minutes accumulated in that octagon that will prove to pay dividends over the course of 25 minutes this weekend at UFC 317? I want to get your thoughts and your predictions down below. I hope you all enjoyed these title fight breakdowns for UFC 317 between Ilia Topuria and Charles Oliveira, and between Alexandre Pantoja and Kai Kara-France. Truthfully, both of these fights, if they go 25 minutes, have potential to be fight of the year contenders. And I am absolutely stoked to see how they play out at lightweight and at flyweight, and I hope you all are too. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new, because we are continuing to chase the goal of reaching 1,000 subscribers before the end of 2025, and any and all support is greatly appreciated. Alongside weekly previews and breakdowns of the biggest fights and all of the best storylines, in the aftermath of every card, I give my recaps on the most meaningful results, and I give my thoughts on MMA news and fight announcements. You can join the community on social media at Verbal Spar MMA on X, Instagram, and TikTok, as well as like the Facebook page Verbal Sparring MMA. And if you enjoy podcast episodes where you can get everything on this channel but in one place instead of multiple videos, you can follow the show on Spotify, Apple, and any other podcast listening platform, because long form episodes release every Monday and Friday. Have a great weekend, enjoy the fights, and I will see you all in the next video.